One empire fed prisoners to river monsters for entertainment, another one built its entire economy on kidnapping children, and one empire you were probably taught to admire in school ran a slave trade so brutal that historians still argue about how many millions never made it out alive. Stick around, because number one on this list did something so twisted that even seasoned historians have a hard time saying it out loud. This is Trivia Tide, and today we're counting down 11 empires that history books love to glorify, but that hid horrors most people never learn about. Let's get into it. Number 11. The Aztec Empire. Everyone knows the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice. What most people don't know is the scale. Spanish accounts, though certainly exaggerated for propaganda, describe the dedication of the Great Temple in Tenochtitlan, involving thousands of sacrifices over a period of days. Modern archaeologists have found skull racks and towers built from human remains, confirming the practice was real, even if the numbers were inflated. The Aztecs ran what's essentially a farming system for war captives. They deliberately fought flower wars with neighboring cities, not to conquer territory, but purely to capture prisoners for sacrifice. It was a supply chain built entirely around ritual killing. Number 10. The Belgian Congo. This one barely gets taught anywhere, and that's exactly why it belongs on this list. King Leopold II of Belgium personally owned the Congo as his private property, not as a colony of Belgium, but as his own possession. He never once set foot there. His agents forced villagers to harvest rubber, and if quotas weren't met, the punishment was to cut off the hands of workers, including children. Historians estimate the death toll from disease, starvation, and violence during Leopold's rule at around 10 million people, though estimates vary widely. That's roughly half the population of the region at the time. Leopold made an enormous personal fortune off the Congo, and Belgium's king only expressed regret over it in 2020, and it still wasn't a full formal apology. Number 9. The Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans get remembered for beautiful architecture and spreading trade across 3 continents. What gets skipped over is the devshirme system. The empire would periodically take Christian boys, often as young as 6, from Balkan villages as a tax paid in children, rather than money. These boys were converted, trained, and forced into either military service as janissaries or palace administration. Some rose to incredible power. Most simply vanished from their families forever. The empire also ran one of history's longest-running slave markets, trafficking people from Eastern Europe and Africa for roughly 400 years. A system that historians note lasted even longer than the transatlantic slave trade. Number 8. The Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan gets a strange kind of modern rebrand as a genius strategist and unifier. The body count tells a different story. Historians estimate the Mongol conquests killed somewhere between 30 and 40 million people, a number so large that some researchers argue it temporarily cooled the Earth's climate because so much farmland reverted to forest, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. The Mongols also perfected psychological warfare on a scale rarely discussed. Before attacking a city, they'd offer surrender terms, refuse, and every single person inside would be executed as a warning to the next city down the road. It worked. Cities surrendered without a fight, simply out of terror. Number 7. The British Empire. Britain's empire is often framed as the one that brought railroads, law, and English to the world. Less discussed is the deliberate use of famine as a policy tool. During the Bengal famine of 1943, British colonial policy diverted food away from starving Indian civilians to supply troops elsewhere, while officials in London delayed relief efforts for months. Estimates place the death toll at up to 3 million people, largely from a famine that historians argue was worsened, if not caused, by administrative choices rather than a true food shortage. This wasn't an isolated event either. Multiple famines across British-controlled India throughout the 1800s and 1900s were worsened by policies prioritizing exports over feeding local populations. Number 6. The Assyrian Empire. Ancient Assyria basically invented psychological terror as state policy, and they were remarkably proud of it. Assyrian kings had their conquests carved into palace walls in graphic detail, showing flayed skin, impaled bodies, and severed heads stacked into pyramids. This wasn't propaganda hidden from the public. It was proudly displayed art meant to be seen by visiting diplomats, specifically to intimidate them before negotiations even began. The empire also pioneered mass deportation as a control tactic, relocating entire conquered populations hundreds of miles from home to prevent rebellion, a strategy later empires would copy for centuries. Number 5, the Spanish Empire. Spain's conquest of the Americas gets remembered for gold and exploration. What often gets minimized is the Encomienda system. Spanish colonizers were granted legal rights to indigenous labor, meaning entire communities could be forced into labor for a specific colonist, essentially a form of slavery with legal cover. Combined with diseases brought from Europe, some regions saw population declines of over 90% within a century of contact. In the silver mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, indigenous and enslaved workers died in such staggering numbers that it's said locals joked the silver taken from the mountain could pave a road to Spain built from bones. Number 4, the Roman Empire. Rome gets endless praise for roads, aqueducts, and law. Less discussed is that Roman society ran on an almost unimaginable scale of slavery. At the height of the empire, historians estimate as much as 30 to 40% of Italy's population was enslaved. Slaves worked mines, farms, and households, and were routinely worked to death in operations like the Spanish silver mines under Roman control, considered so brutal that miners' life expectancy was measured in months, not years. Rome's entertainment industry doubled down on this cruelty. Gladiatorial games weren't just entertainment, they were public executions dressed up as sport, and prisoners were sometimes forced into staged sea battles inside flooded arenas purely for spectacle. Number 3. The Japanese Empire. Imperial Japan's expansion in the 20th century is often reduced to a footnote about World War II, but the human cost inside occupied territories rarely gets its full spotlight. Unit 731 was a secret Japanese military research program that conducted human experimentation on Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, including deliberate infection with plague, cholera, and anthrax to study disease progression. Victims were dissected alive without anesthesia, so doctors could observe organ damage in real time. After the war, the United States quietly granted immunity to many of the scientists involved in exchange for their research data, a decision that stayed classified for decades. Number 2, the British East India Company. This wasn't a government, it was a corporation, and it ran its own private army larger than most European nations' entire militaries. At its peak, the East India Company commanded roughly 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army itself. It effectively governed hundreds of millions of people across India for profit, answering primarily to shareholders rather than any government. The company's opium trade forced into China created one of the largest drug addiction crises in human history, eventually triggering the Opium Wars when China tried to stop the imports. A private company started a war to protect its drug trafficking profits. Number 1, the Inca Empire and the horror hidden in its conquest. Remember what we teased at the start? Here it is. The Inca Empire itself gets romanticized as a peaceful sun-worshipping civilization of engineers. What gets left out is Capacocha, a ritual where children, chosen specifically for their beauty and considered flawless, were led on ceremonial journeys to mountain summits, given alcohol and coca to numb them, and then left to die of exposure as offerings to the gods. Frozen mummies of these children have been found remarkably preserved in the Andes, discovered wearing intricate clothing meant to honor their sacrifice. But the truly horrifying twist comes after the Spanish conquest. Spanish colonizers, fascinated and repulsed by Inca resistance, publicly executed rebel leaders and displayed their bodies as warnings to anyone who dared rise up again. A brutal practice meant to permanently humiliate resistance even after death. It's one of the most disturbing colonial practices in South American history, and it's almost never taught alongside the empire's more celebrated achievements in architecture and astronomy. Two empires, one indigenous and one colonial, both hiding horrors behind achievements we're taught to admire. History loves a highlight reel. Beautiful architecture, clever engineering, sweeping conquests. But every empire on this list built its legacy on something the textbooks conveniently leave out. Which one of these surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more of history's darkest secrets uncovered, hit subscribe, because Trivia Tide drops new videos every week that dig up what the history books skip. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.